My name is Brendan Teeling. On behalf of Dublin City Council, great pleasure to welcome you to the Dublin Festival of History here this afternoon. Delighted to welcome so many of you here in the room, but also all of those who are watching online. And also like to welcome our ISL interpreters, Vanessa and Cormac. You know, usually when we have events about Germany on the festival, we tend to be talking about one of the world wars. And so it's great to see so many people here for a talk on the earlier history of Germany. We're delighted to be welcoming Katja Hoyer back to the festival. Katja is a German-British historian and journalist, and she's a visiting research fellow at King's College London and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. And she also writes for Washington Post, the Spectator, the Telegraph, and the Welt. I think I said that right. And she's here to talk about her debut book, Blood and Iron. Now, Robert Gerwarth is a fixture at our festival. He's been here every year, either as a moderator or a speaker, and we're delighted to see Robert back here again. He's the Professor of Modern History at the UCD. So Robert's going to come on stage shortly, but in the meantime, please give a Dublin welcome to Katja Hoyer.
It's good to be here in person this year. Last year I did it online, and it's always a bit odd talking to my own PowerPoint, really, so it's great to see people in the flesh. I apologize in advance if my British-German hybrid accent is a bit grating on Irish ears. I try and emphasize the German side tonight, so if that's perhaps preferable. We'll see how far we get with that. So I'll start briefly by just saying what I actually tried to do with the book, which I think will frame the rest of the discussion and the rest of the talk as well. So this came out last year in 2021 because that was the 150th anniversary of the foundation of Germany as a nation state. And I think people often forget that because Germany is mentioned in one breath quite often with France, Britain, the US, you know, as a sort of standard sort of Western state. But actually, people forget that it's the youngest of those European states, and therefore has got a lot of teething problems, to phrase it mildly, when it sort of starts to begin to come to terms with the idea that it is, in fact, one nation and sort of tries to set itself up as one. I found it quite interesting that, given that it was 150 years last year, there was almost no discussion or mention of that in Germany at all. The only acknowledgement was that the German president invited two historians to his office, and had a chat with them about what that means for Germany and German nationhood. I wouldn't have expected celebrations as such, given obviously what happened in the 20th century and the shadows that throws further back into German history, but some sort of acknowledgement or discussion, I think, would have been in order. So that's kind of what I was trying to do with that book last year, is just spark that a little bit, because I do think it's important and it's interesting for Germany still today. I think Germany has got a little bit of a tendency, because of Nazism, the Second World War, and the Holocaust, to see that as kind of the starting and end point of something, as opposed to a point that happened pretty much in the middle of its history as a nation state. So the idea that Germany sort of starts, modern Germany that is, either in 1949, where sort of West Germany was born out of the ashes of the Second World War, and that's quite often seen as a kind of 0 hour, it's called in German, or Stunde Null, kind of the beginning, tabula rasa, let's start again, in which case everything that happened before, there's a line drawn there, it's not part of what modern Germany is. Or even, I mean, tomorrow is actually the only thing that Germany has that comes close to a sort of national day, if you will, which is German Unity Day on the 3rd of October, which harks back to German reunification in 1990. So Germany was reunified on the 3rd of October 1990. So either that is seen as the beginning of modern Germany, or 1949, but not 1871, because people are a little bit sort of afraid to go there and don't really know what to make of it. So once again, Blood and Iron was meant to show some of the things that I think should be highlighted in that part of German history. It shouldn't all be either forgotten or seen as a prelude to Nazism. There were other aspects to the Kaiser Reich that I think are worth highlighting, not least the fact that it was actually a half democracy, which is often forgotten. Yes, it was half an autocracy as well, but it was also half a democracy. And the fact that that gave itself up voluntarily in 1914 when it seemed stable, it seemed, Germany had finally found its feet. And then suddenly in 1914, in August, Parliament almost dissolves itself, basically, by giving all the powers to the executive, basically turning itself into a military dictatorship. And I think that's worth remembering, that there was a half democracy there that gave itself up, which teaches us, I think, a lot of lessons for today. So let's go back right to the beginning very briefly. So this is a map of the Holy Roman Empire, which if you go back a little bit in terms of the phrasing of that, or the framing of it, so this is sometimes referred to as the First Reich, the First Empire, if you will. Then you have the Second Reich, which is the Kaiser Reich, which is what my book's about, and then the Nazis framed themselves as the Third Reich, so hence the terminology. The reason why I want to go back there very quickly, so this is before the Napoleonic Wars, around about 1800, is because I think it just shows a lot about Germany. So you had over 400 little states and principalities and kingdoms and free cities that all kind of did their own thing, had their own currencies, had their own rulers, their own laws, their own measurements, basically did their own thing. And yes, there was a kind of overarching structure, which is the Holy Roman Empire, but really that only kicked in when the Holy Roman Emperor wanted to go to war. And even then he had to haggle and curse and kind of bribe people into following him into war. So there's no sense of nationhood at this point. And when you think that that's, it's quite remarkable. So in 1800, very little or very few people thought of themselves as German, or thought a Germany should come into existence. And then 70 years later, you suddenly have a German nation state. And that perhaps tells you a lot about kind of how tumultuous and how artificial to some extent that is. And then ironically, it was a Frenchman who basically helped a lot unifying Germany, namely Napoleon. When he invaded the German lands, he sort of picked them off one by one. So some of them were bribed, some of them were given the sort of status of kingdoms, others were outright defeated, such as Prussia, most notably in 1806 at the twin battle of Austerlitz and Jena. So that gave Germany for the first time, or the German lands for the first time, a sense of a foreign invader is coming into, so foreign, very obviously foreign, even if you are, say, in the Rhineland and you consider yourself a Rhinelander, a Frenchman is very different from, say, a Bavarian who at least vaguely speaks the same language, although I'm not sure how much I would consider that the same language. I struggle understanding Bavarian sometimes. But the point is that this is Germany for the first time identifying some commonality there because it's against somebody else. And that, I think, is a theme that you see running through, especially with the French, running through the entire sort of history that my book covers as well. But ironically, it was then this Frenchman who decided that actually kind of conquering these lands and keeping hold of them isn't easy when you have 400 different people to talk to. And so Napoleon unified Germany a little bit, making it only 39 states to sort of deal with. So that's whittling it down to a manageable number. And when Napoleon was eventually defeated, by the German people basically uniting under the Prussian king, more or less. I mean, there were obviously the Austrians and other coalition partners as well, but it's the Prussian king who comes out in 1813, for the first time appeals to his fellow Prussians. Even that was quite, so people were thinking, what do you mean fellow Prussians? Because even within Prussia, people were fractured. And for the first time, you get German-speaking peoples all fighting together against a common enemy, the French, which sets up a rather unfortunate pattern. But when Napoleon is finally defeated in 1815 and the Congress of Vienna kind of regulates the new order in Europe, this is what's left of it. So you see, in comparison to what Germany looked like before and after, you can really see the impact that the Napoleonic Wars have had on the country. Importantly, at this point, Prussia also gets the lands in the west that you can see there, so the bit that's colored in blue is all Prussia. Which at this point in 1815, I don't think people were realizing what a gift they were giving to Prussia there with the Rhineland. This is where Germany's coal and iron ore reserves are. It's industrial heartland, which didn't really matter as much in 1815 because the Industrial Revolution was very, very slowly only starting in the German lands. But this is what allowed Prussia over the 19th century to basically press ahead and become the preeminent German power over Austria, which was much more powerful to start with. The problem is that this kind of very loose German confederation, or the Bund, that kind of comes out of 1815, is still dominated by Austria, which gets the chairmanship without rotation or anything. So Prussia basically across the 19th century gets increasingly aggravated about that and says, well, look, we're becoming more and more powerful, and we should be the main German state, and Austria has got the permanent chairmanship of that. So the dualism between Prussia and Austria is coming to a head. This man plays a huge role in the process, Otto von Bismarck, who I think by now is probably not a secret I quite admire for a lot of things, even though he has become more and more of a critically viewed figure. It's quite interesting that he was born in 1815, the very same year that Napoleon was beaten. And so he grows up as a little boy with all of these stories about how awful the French behaved when they came into his hometown, and his parents would tell him about how they looted and behaved awfully. And then also the kind of afterglow of this kind of nationalist fervor that came from the Napoleonic Wars, from having rallied together and beaten the French. That's the kind of context, cultural context, that Bismarck grows up in. And I think that's quite important for the way that he views kind of the world around him. He's not a nationalist, I just want to point this out at this point, so he never ever at any point kind of views the idea of a German nation as kind of an ideal to be aspired to. His point about unifying Germany later as the minister-president of Prussia is that it's an extension of Prussian power. So his idea is that if Prussia rallies all the other German states behind it and can make it an extended kind of Prussian realm, then that's good for Prussia. And that's why he does it. He's not one of the kind of idealists in the century, of whom there are many, who want to unify Germany for that reason. The speech that is perhaps his most famous speech, and that I named the book after as well, is delivered in the context of 1862, when the Prussian king is trying to reform the military. So the military had still, as it was in the Napoleonic Wars, been a militia force, so basically a citizen army. So Prussia has always had a long tradition of that because of the way that it's kind of got no natural boundaries, so it needs to sort of raise a people's army, if you will, ordinary people raising up. But the problem is that that was a very nationalist kind of force, so they were fighting for Germany, really ideologically, and were therefore not necessarily directly loyal to the Prussian king. So the king's worried, wants to change that into a professional army that is loyal directly to the king. Parliament at this point, Prussian parliament, says absolutely not, because we know what you're going to do with that army, because they'd seen in the 1848 revolutions how bloody they could, basically any sort of citizens' uprising could be if the king or anybody else in power has got the means to crush those uprisings. And so this conflict is coming to a head to a point where the Prussian king, Frederick William III, fourth at this point, is... no, sorry, that's William I already. So William I is already so kind of beleaguered by Parliament that he is on the brink of abdicating. And it's at that point that his advisors go, right, we need to sort this out. We need the man to do this, and the man is Bismarck, who's at this point the French ambassador, or the ambassador to France. So he gets called back, delivers the speech to Parliament, and effectively says, not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be decided, but by iron and blood. Meaning, you know, you can make your decisions in Parliament. It's all well and nice that you're discussing things in a civilized manner, but you won't get your big Germany. You won't get the big question of the day, namely the German question, German unification, done unless you've got the military power behind it. And with those words, he basically just decides to have the military reforms anyway, does it illegally, so Parliament doesn't agree with that, and tells them, well, this is just how it's going to be. And that's why these words kind of became so infamous even at the time, and were very, very quickly becoming sort of iconic for Bismarck's kind of brutal realpolitik. And then Bismarck goes ahead with what he said he would do, and unifies Germany through blood and iron. So there are 3 unification wars against Denmark, Austria, and then France. And you end up with a unified Germany. This is Bismarck here with the French Emperor Napoleon III after they were, or he was beaten at the Battle of Sedan in 1870. And that's sort of the foundation of this German nation state to start with. On the back of that defeat, Bismarck sort of decides that there's so much nationalist fervor again, just like there had been in 1815, that might be enough to get all of the different German princes and dukedoms and so on together to basically form a German nation state at this point. And that's kind of how he does it. So he uses, once again, the very brief moment of German togetherness, of German commonality, namely they just defeated the French again, to say this is what we can do if we sort of stand together, and he uses that moment to unify Germany. Importantly, Wilhelm I isn't, so the Prussian king, isn't overly keen on that. I mean, recent research has shown that he wasn't quite as reluctant as previously shown, but he was certainly not a huge fan of the idea that he would now become a German emperor, because he wanted to be the Prussian king in the first, second, and third. And Bismarck, the only way that Bismarck convinces him that this is a good idea and he should now become the German emperor as opposed to just the Prussian king, is that he says to him that he'll run this state for him. He doesn't have to do anything. He can stay in his Prussian palaces, go hunting, do everything that he had done before, and Bismarck will run the shop. And that's how Bismarck sets up the constitution as well. It's very much kind of Bismarck is the chancellor, is basically administering the entire Reich, and you've got the Kaiser at the top, technically the head of state, but in practice very much removed from that role because Bismarck just manages the whole thing for him. So why am I saying then that there's a bit of democracy here as well, when I've just shown that this Reich was kind of, plastered together with the blood of Germany's enemies under Bismarck's blood and iron policy? It's because Bismarck realized that he couldn't do it without nationalism. And nationalism was, it's easy to forget today, was a liberal concept. So the idea that you have a nation state, rather than being loyal to a dynasty, to a king, to a hereditary kind of system of power, was liberal. So the idea that you have a constitution, the rule of law, even the king or the Kaiser would be tied to that, and that was nationalism in the 19th century. So the idea that there would be kind of a common agreement by the people, and even the monarchy could be tied to it. Bismarck realized that had to happen, being a monarchist himself. So I'm not saying he was a kind of figurehead of democracy, but he realized that there was so much kind of unrest about this, not least with the 1848 revolutions that had torn Europe, or thrown Europe into chaos briefly in 1848 and 1849, that he decided we need to have a parliament and we need to have a proper parliament. And so he basically made parliament part of the entire constitution, and that parliament would be elected by all males over the age of 25. So there was universal male suffrage, which was quite progressive for the time compared to other European states, because there were no social or kind of land ownership restrictions on who could vote and who couldn't. And that is something that comes back to bite Bismarck quite a lot. So whilst Bismarck, just lastly on that, is often portrayed, when he is the Chancellor of Germany, the first Chancellor, he's often portrayed as running the country a bit like this. So basically with the whip in his hand, standing in parliament, and there is a lot of truth to that. So Bismarck was awful when it came to bullying people, for example, into getting his will in parliament. He was huge. He's a bear of a man, absolutely sort of tall, broad-shouldered, barrel-chested, very kind of steely blue eyes. So people were quite intimidated by him. And when he came in and sort of growled at somebody, or burst into tears, as he quite often did as well, so he'd just have a tantrum until he got what he wanted. It worked. There's a bit of nepotism involved, so he installs his son as the foreign minister, for example. So it's not pretty. So hence why this sort of quote is often associated with them. Laws are like sausages; it's better not to see them being made. And Bismarck certainly lived by that statement. But it's also worth saying that this is the first German Reichstag building. I wish we had it back. That looks lovely with the park in front of it, so I think they should bring that park back, certainly. But that's not a parliament building, that a cowed kind of parliament that doesn't really have a place in the system builds for itself. That's a statement of intent. I mean, it's huge, it's kind of grand, it says something about the self-confidence that this first German parliament had, if they build that, for themselves as a building that was finished in 1894. And I think it's also telling that it's slightly outside of the kind of what was dubbed the Mile of Power at the time. So the Prussian palace is about a mile down the road, and the palace of the Hohenzollern. dynasty. It's outside of that, so hence why you've basically got the Brandenburg Gate and then the Reichstag outside of that. And if you go the other side of the Brandenburg Gate, that's where all of the sort of civil service sat and everything else. So it's kind of outside, but part of Berlin, and that was deliberate. So they were saying we're not part of the old system, we're not part of the kind of oppression and the sort of corruption and all that. We're different. We're sitting there. We're holding people to account, and that's the thing that I find the most interesting about that empire. Is by 1914, Parliament has really carved out a place for itself. The Social Democratic Party, the SPD, are the largest political party in 1912. This is not a parliament that just sits there and says, okay, we are a fig leaf of democracy, as Karl Liebknecht, the father of Wilhelm Liebknecht, said. So this is very much part of the system. They have the purse strings to the budget. So if they hadn't agreed in 1914 to go to war, they couldn't have gone to war. So this is, it's not a decision where Parliament gets pushed into that or it kind of gets sidelined. It sidelines itself. And that's a point that I think is worth making, is that actually, there was a very confident Parliament in 1914. This wasn't a sort of system where you see them as a prelude to Nazism, because it was always going to go down that route. There's also, just lastly, a lot of, let me just go back to this. So there's also a lot of emphasis quite often on Bismarck's oppression of socialism and social democracy. And that's absolutely true. So the SPD gets banned, for example, for a long time, the Social Democratic Party, and Bismarck does try and put this kind of socialist jack in the box back in its box. Which is impossible, and Bismarck realizes that. And so you also, alongside the repression measures, comes a lot of kind of a huge package of welfare reforms as well. So he does introduce stuff like pensions and accident insurance and those kinds of things, which for the first time you actually get a kind of package of social welfare, state-run social welfare means as well. So what I wanted to point out with this is it's pretty much a halfway house, this kind of Kaiser Reich thing. And a lot of the things that make Germany today stem from it. Bismarck also secularizes the system a lot. So you get, for instance, civil marriage, which still in Germany is obligatory. You cannot get married unless you also get married in a sort of civil ceremony, and therefore making it legal. So all of those things state that the separation of state and church go back to this. A lot of modern Germany originates from the 19th century and not from 1949 or 1989. And I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katja, for this introductory talk, and also, of course, for the excellent book that you have written about Imperial Germany. I'm sure that, as someone who grew up in Germany, I remember that for a long time, the sort of standard narrative was, well, in some ways, Imperial Germany is kind of no more than a prehistory of the bigger events in the 20th century, particularly the Nazis, the Nazi dictatorship, and that in some ways there are lots of continuities from Bismarck as a sort of towering leader of Germany all the way to the 1930s, that after the lost First World War, there was a longing for a strong leader to bring Germany back to the heights where it once was in the 1890s, if you like. So you're clearly setting out to paint a much more ambivalent picture about Imperial Germany. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit more, some of it you already touched upon in your talk, about that strange state, Imperial Germany, the Kaiserreich, a state that has a parliament and a constitution, but has a government that is independent from it, that on the one hand introduces some of the most progressive laws and, generally speaking, provisions for poorer people, for working people, but at the same time also, as you say, kind of tries to shut out quite large segments of society, from the Social Democrats to political Catholicism, from political decision-making. So how can we kind of come to terms with that ambivalent state, and what does it tell us about what happens in German history afterwards?
I think what people struggle to come to terms with is that these reforms and the modernization that you do see in that time, they don't come from above. So it's not like Bismarck is a Democrat, or Bismarck wants a social welfare system, or he says, oh, we need to bring Germany into modernity. I mean, the elites are still very much with their minds in the past. Kaiser Wilhelm even more so. So when he takes over in 1888 from his, well, very briefly, his father was in power for 100 days. But before that, you still had Wilhelm I in power, who was born in the previous century. You know, and people again forget that, but he was born in 1797 and he was in power still in the 1870s. So the old elites really dragged this kind of old understanding of power with them way into modernity and are so keen to cling on to that. And Bismarck is a classic example. He is a Junker, so part of the Prussian aristocracy, is trying to defend the social position of these people whose wealth is based on land ownership, which in turn is based on agriculture. So that's slowly being phased out. You got the industrial elites, kind of the middle classes, the new middle classes, being more and more confident and wanting change. And it's that dichotomy, I think, that really shapes the age. It's kind of the pressures that come from the lower classes in the form of social democracy and socialism, alongside the middle classes wanting a more sort of liberal, more democratic state, because they haven't got the titles to give them power. They do need parliament to kind of convert their own status into political power. And then at the top, the old aristocracy and the monarchy basically trying to hold on to what it once had. And I think the result is what you see, pretty much a half and half picture, which shows in social policy and in the way that you've got the economy being one of the most modern in the world at that point, and yet is kind of overseen by a system that doesn't really like it and wants to kind of reverse some of the more modern tendencies that come with that.
Mm-hmm. Bismarck, the man who's kind of at the heart of the story of the foundation of the German state, has in some ways made a bit of a comeback, I think, in recent years as a sort of father of realpolitik. And I mean, the quotation that has also informed the title of your book is something that, of course, has been referenced time and again in the current debates about how to respond to the crisis in Ukraine and other questions as well, that decisions are no longer made by parliamentary debates, but rather by the decision to go to war, which is, of course, something that Europeans in the 21st century are no longer used to. So how relevant do you think is Bismarck today?
It's an interesting one because his charisma seems to sort of echo through the ages. He's always a figure that fascinates people and that doesn't seem to kind of go away over time. So I think just the idea of having somebody who knows what to do, who you can look up to, seems to have appeal to people still. Whether that's true or not, that's what people kind of want to see in him, this kind of idea of the strong man coming back. And you see that, across the world, that people in the chaos and in the uncertainty that we now see turn back to kind of more autocratic leadership by, be that Erdogan or Putin or Trump, or, you basically got this idea coming back that somebody just needs to take the reins and never mind this parliamentary business of debating things. It's all well and nice when it's peacetime and when everything works, but now we just need somebody to do things. I think that's the appeal that Bismarck still has, but I think people underestimate how much he worked with Parliament and how he was reliant on compromising, on finding alliances, breaking alliances, but he had to constantly work with Parliament to the extent where actually he was thinking about getting rid of it and doing some sort of coup on his own state that he invented. So by the end of the 1880s, he's so desperate, so annoyed with Parliament that he thinks, like, let's just get rid of it again. So I think Bismarck's relevant as an example of the statesman that some people want to have back, of a type of leader, a sort of intelligent, well-read, dominant sort of figure that went out of fashion in the second half of the 20th century. And I think there's a longing for that to come back in certain societies because they feel the uncertainty of the times that we live in.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the undoing of Imperial Germany begins with the First World War in many ways, and for a long time in historical debates, there was an emphasis on Imperial Germany being the driver behind that war. So in your book, how do you position yourself in that debate?
Well, I certainly think the First World War deserves a more central place in German history overall, as I think the thing that makes and breaks it. More so, I would say, even than the Second World War, because that's, I think, as it's sometimes been called, the Urkatastrophe, or the arch catastrophe of the 20th century. And I think that's very much the case for Germany specifically as well. It's hard to see how the conflicts within. So people often, when they talk about causes of the First World War and kind of could it have been avoided, focus very much on the European situation. But even within Germany, you had such a huge amount of social conflict, political conflict. It looks like stability in 1914 to most ordinary people on the streets, but it's actually stagnation rather than stability, as I argue in the book as well, because Parliament, certainly since sort of the new Parliament in 1912, doesn't really do much, because you've got half of it full of Social Democrats and liberals, the other half's full of conservatives, and it's literally half and half. And whenever you try and decide anything, be that more progressive sort of legislation as the Social Democrats and Liberals want it, the Conservatives go against it, vice versa. If they want to cut back on the welfare state, for example, it doesn't go through either. So I think something had to happen, and it certainly, Kaiser Wilhelm sits there and thinks, well, we've done this a lot. You know, as I said earlier, this kind of idea of unifying Germans against somebody else has worked time and again through the 19th century. And Wilhelm sort of sits there and thinks, well, colonialism worked as well in that direction, in the sense that everyone can sort of gather behind the idea of extending German markets and German power basically behind the leadership of the Kaiser. And 1914 is the ultimate example of that. So the Kaiser declares, right, I don't know any more political parties now, quite famously in 1914, and then says, you all Germans, rally behind me, I'll be your focal point. And that, I think, seems to have such an appeal on Germans that they go to war, and then eventually that's too much blood and iron for the society and for the Kaiserreich to live with that, and that's what breaks it in the end. But it's interesting that democracy actually dies in 1914 rather than 1918.
Fascinating that you mentioned, obviously, Wilhelm II as the second sort of dominant figure in the Kaiserreich, the man who famously sacks Bismarck. Could you tell us a little bit more about him as a person? Because, of course, he's very much vilified. After 1918, the Allies want to put him on trial. He famously deserts his post in 1918, flees into the Netherlands, and goes into exile rather than facing the revolution in Germany. So who is Wilhelm II?
Yeah, just maybe let's start on that last point, actually. I find that quite interesting that even in 1918, people get a sense that if the monarchy has to come to an end, it should sort of come to an end in a less ignominious way. So Ludendorff, who sort of is one of the two figureheads of the German war effort, so you've got Hindenburg and Ludendorff as the two leaders, loses the plot a little bit towards the end of the First World War, I'd say, and actually encourages Wilhelm to ride out on his horse into the opposing troops and sort of have one last battle appearance, and then gets kind of killed in this last sort of stand of the Kaiser, and the Kaiser goes, no, I'm not doing that, and sort of flees to Holland. So yes, I think obviously people view Wilhelm in hindsight in the light of what happened in the First World War. But he is an incredibly ambivalent figure. He's so difficult to grasp. He will sort of say one thing 1 minute and something else the next, and it's very difficult to see what he actually thought from 1 minute to the next, because he was very, very impressionable. I spent some time in the book on him, because I think one of the biggest issues was that he was without inspiration or guidance in any shape or form. He was somebody who was very, very obsessed almost with being loved and being appreciated by the people. So he'd sit there over the breakfast table and just read the papers and see any little word that was mentioned on him, and gets very upset when people say something that he thinks isn't true, and had, you know, sort of fit at the breakfast table over these things. But on the flip side, because his father was dead, his grandfather was dead, he'd ousted Bismarck. There isn't anybody who can guide this young Kaiser. He's still in his 20s, in his late 20s when he becomes Kaiser. To sort of help him kind of run the country. And he isn't somebody who's got an instinctive kind of, you know, he can't really read the room. I think that's part of his problem. I mean, by that, I mean even in a metaphorical sense, kind of read the sort of mood in Europe and in the world. And there isn't anybody that dares sort of sit next to him and say, you can't do that, or you can't say that. People kind of just let him run with it. I mean, one of the chancellors, Bülow, who tries to on occasion sort of edit some of the speeches, gets incredibly exasperated because the Kaiser will just put the piece of paper that Bülow had just edited to the side and just deliver a speech, and people just sit there and go, did you just say that? You know, like the famous Hun speech, for example, when he sends German soldiers off to China to suppress the Boxer uprising. And he says, behave like the Huns to them. You know, people just said, did I hear that right? And then Bülow was trying to, afterwards, sort of give the press a brief without that in it. But by that point, obviously, the thousands of soldiers had heard it, the whole press had heard it who were present in the speech. And those things, I think, just give you an idea of how impulsive he was, how from one minute to the next, he would just make a snap decision like that and say something completely different. So I think he's a very difficult figure to pin down because he had so many different views and changes them so often.
We should add, of course, that he was Queen Victoria's favorite grandchild, just to put that spin on it as well. Before I open up to questions from the floor, I'm just interested in the timing of this renewed interest in the history of Imperial Germany. I'm not sure how many people here in the room are following the debates, public debates in Germany, but there's quite a lot of talk at the moment again about German colonialism. There's quite a lot of talk about, the heirs to the fortunes of the Kaiser. The current head of the house of the royal family is famously demanding back some of his the family's assets, including one of the castles in Potsdam outside of Berlin. And there's a massive public debate, including Bundestag hearings, parliamentary hearings about it. There's also at the same time debates about the modernity of Imperial Germany, about the modern aspects of it. So why now? Why is this discussion taking place now?
I think for a long time it was completely overshadowed by coming to terms with the catastrophe and the crimes committed under the Nazis. And that, I think, took both East and West Germany a long time, if ever they kind of got completely to terms with it. And then obviously, because Germany was split after the Second World War as well, once you have reunification, it's kind of yet another debate. What is Germany? What is this modern Germany now? And I think now that that's, again, 30 years past, people are beginning to sort of look a little bit beyond 1945, further back into the past. I think another reason is that when you look at world developments, so in the US in particular, you had the Black Lives Matter movement, the statue wars, culture wars, and so on and so forth. A little bit of that is coming into Germany as well. So as Britain and the US are talking about slavery and colonial matters, I think that is also something that made lots of Germans kind of stop in their tracks and think, well, hang on, the German Empire obviously doesn't compare in size and scale to say, the British or the French Empire, but it was, in terms of landmass, the third largest, which, yes, is small because the others were so big. But it's still a sizable empire, and obviously horrific crimes and genocide were committed in those lands as well. And from that angle alone, I think, there are now more people looking back at the empire, and in particular the overseas empire, with renewed interest.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Katja. Are there questions from the floor? This gentleman here raised his arm immediately. So,
you used the term nation-state, but what was the nation? Because a big chunk of the German nation, as was, i.e. Austria, wasn't part of it.
Yeah.
And then there were Poles in Prussia, French in Alsace-Lorraine, Danes in Schleswig-Holstein, which were in it. So is the term nation-state perhaps a bit misleading?
Yeah, and I think that's also part of Germany's problem right from the beginning. So just to maybe clarify that term quickly, so when you literally take the term nation-state, so the idea that a nation, kind of a homogeneous group of people with one language, one culture, lives in one state and therefore under one umbrella, that's very, very difficult to do for Germany because of the lack of physical boundaries to its country. So it's easier. Ireland is a perfect example of that, as is Britain. France to some extent, because you got the mountain ranges on both sides, sort of distinguishing it in the sea. Germany hasn't got that, and because of that, you have German enclaves pretty much sort of spread over the whole of Central Europe, which was also one of the problems after the Second World War in terms of the kind of German communities that lived in what is now Poland and Lithuania and Russia and so on and so forth. The exclusion of Austria is perhaps the most obvious example of that. So this is something that is very much a debate exactly because of the reasons that you mentioned. So the idea of we're forming a nation state here, should we have Austria in it or not? And it's simply coming down to this kind of dualism between Prussia and Austria, which comes to a head in the war between them in 1866. That makes it a political decision to sort of exclude Austria from that. But yes, in that respect, the term nation state in and of itself is problematic, not least because of the millions of non-German speakers that are now suddenly within the German realms as well. And I think because there's such a debate around that, you also get a certain amount of sort of angst within the leadership about that. So even in the 19th century, way before the Nazis come into power, you got these sort of Völkisch movements, they're called, like ethnic movements, who emphasize sort of what they see as Teutonic or sort of German qualities, you know, so they get sort of old runes, ancient runes back out and claim that that's kind of some ancient Germanity that is going on there. Hitler, quite famously with Goering, had these kind of Hitler cows bred again that was supposed to be the Auer ox, kind of the arch sort of Germanic animal with sort of great, it's literally a cow that they rebreed with big horns on it. It's not the original thing. Apparently there's still a few of those around in Ukraine or somewhere, I think, where they set up a nature reserve. But you just get the sense that throughout the decades, that within whoever runs the country, there is a fear that this isn't a proper nation state because we haven't got a homogenous kind of group of people here that all go back to the same roots. So yes, the term is problematic in that sense.
There's sort of, as a coda to that, I mean, in 1918, when the empire is defeated in the First World War and Austria-Hungary it basically implodes, there is a brief moment where precisely that question is back on the table. And when the Republic of Austria, as it's then called, votes to join Germany. But the Allies say, no, well, we can't have Germany emerge larger than it was in 1914 from their defeat. So that question then comes up time and again. And in 1938, Hitler picks it up again and says, well, Austria is going to become part of the greater German Reich. Yeah, exactly. So there's a hand up there, yeah.
Could I ask you what sense of power did kings and princes have in those days? I mean, way back in the early times, you would have had serfs who kind of, you know, bowed and scraped and so on. But then by the time your period starts, did they have a sense that they had any right to rule? Many of them were related, were they not, to the British royal family, Queen Victoria, whatever, all that sort of thing. I mean, I know she wasn't on the go maybe then. Or she was, wasn't she? Sorry. But anyway, all in all, what relationship did they have with each other? Did they all speak a common language? And what sense of a right to rule did they have, these royal family heads?
It's different across Germany and Britain to a large extent. So when Wilhelm II's father, Frederick, he marries Victoria, who's Queen Victoria's oldest daughter, Vicky, also as she was known. And Vicky has this idea that, like her mother, who was married to Albert, who was German, so there's this kind of Anglo-German couple running Britain. Vicky has this idea that she's going to do the same with Frederick in Germany, not knowing that he would obviously die prematurely of throat cancer. But she thinks the way that the British royal family runs Britain as a parliamentary democracy at this point was certainly moving in that direction as a constitutional monarchy, whereby the royal family in Britain is moving further and further away from power in that time, because they realize with the uprisings that happen and with the social unrest that happens in Britain, they will only stay in power, basically, because they've seen what happened in France at the same time with Napoleon III losing his throne. So they're looking at that, and they're moving further and further away from a kind of medieval-style sort of monarchy. Whilst in Germany, you still at this point, because it's a relatively new country and people are, I would say, more adherent still to the idea of kind of a more absolute monarchy, not completely, but more so. There's a huge backlash from the conservative kind of elites against that. And they fear that the English influence that Vicky will bring to the court will be damaging. So when her husband dies prematurely, there's a collective sigh of relief in Prussia, certainly, at court, that the grandson, Wilhelm II, who's much more conservative, will kind of take over and will preserve that royal power within himself. And it is quite interesting. One of the observers said something along the lines of he drags a piece of the Middle Ages with him wherever he goes. Because people kind of, the pomp that he brought back to the court and the sort of style in which he ran kind of ceremonies, official events and things like that is very much kind of based on the idea of a divine right of kings. And if you go back to the 1848 revolutions, when a German state was nearly formed under a sort of liberal leadership, so a German parliament was already formed in Frankfurt, and they actually offered the Prussian king, at this point, Frederick William IV, the crown and said, do you want to be like the Kaiser of all Germany and we have a constitutional monarchy? He turned it down and said he didn't want a crown that comes from the gutter, meaning from the people rather than from God. So there's still very much a sense that this is a sort of divine right of kings style monarchy, as opposed to the way that England had kind of tried to preserve its own monarchy by modernizing it.
Oh, plenty of questions.
Interesting your resolution for the
So there's a microphone actually coming.
Microphone's behind you.
There's a microphone, otherwise it might be hard to hear for people in the back.
development of social welfare policy. In any way, was this a contribution to the development of European social democracy?
So Bismarck is very much pushed into that. He doesn't really want to have kind of a social democracy. So, don't imagine he's kind of like a liberal reformer who thinks the people ought to have more rights and better lives. He thinks it's perfectly outrageous when people demand like the 8-hour workday and outrageous things like that. Or child labor to be banned, for that matter. But he realizes that without a form of state socialism, as he calls it, so the state kind of needs to take over some of these things, or else this kind of movement will run with it. And because they're still propagating, remember Marx has written his work just shortly before that, so we're talking middle of the 19th century, so this is all kind of explosive new stuff that has come out and people are still discussing it. And all of that is based on the idea that you can't reform society. So Marx is sort of arguing because the elites will hold on to their power, you have to have a revolution to make that happen. And because of that, socialism is seen as something inherently violent and inherently destructive. And so Bismarck is kind of constantly trying to preserve power for the kind of ruling elites by giving in a little bit and taking the wind out of that movement. And that's why you begin to see things like the pensions and so on and so forth, because he sort of thinks that will give people enough so that they're not angry anymore, which also leads later to the idea that socialists and communists after the First World War think that the Social Democrats are their enemy, because it's kind of like they're giving people enough to not be as angry anymore as they need to be to go out onto the streets. And the same happens in Britain to some extent as well, which is why you don't see kind of the mass sort of uprisings that you see in Europe in the same time. So it does contribute to it in the sense that it's one of the most progressive systems in that direction, and people are looking to it to say, well, look, this is what the Germans are doing, why can't we do that here, sort of thing. But equally, Germany is also at political level still one of the kind of most autocratic states. So it's again this kind of halfway system that has a lot of tensions built within it.
Perhaps just...
Yeah, exactly.
Perhaps just to briefly add to that, I mean, I think Bismarck is quite an unusual representative of his social class, the German aristocracy, in the sense that he reads quite extensively, which German aristocrats normally don't do. They spend their days hunting. And he also reads Marx, and he understands the issue of the time, and he understands when Marx says, well, the workers have nothing to lose but their chains. And so what he does is he gives them something to lose, namely their social insurance, and therefore thinks it's much more unlikely that they are going to undertake a revolution in Germany, a social revolution. And I think he's right in that, of course, cynical as that calculation might be. Sorry, there were questions over there.
Hello. This might be beyond the remit of the book, perhaps, but Meiji Japan developed around the same time as Imperial Germany. A lot of similar events, constitutionalization, as well as a broader move toward imperial government. Japan has sometimes been called the Prussia of the East because of those similarities. To what extent was, and again, this may be beyond the remit of the book, but to what extent was Bismarck's statescraft reflected in Japan, and was there any direct contact between the Meiji government and Imperial Germany to try and sort of borrow from those learnings which Bismarck forged?
Yes, that is a little bit beyond my remit, so I don't know exactly what's happening in Japan at the same time. But however, there's an admiration. I do know that there was an admiration for Prussia as a sort of model, not least because of the sort of martial aspect. Obviously, there was always a cultification in Japan of this kind of idea of the sort of supposedly superior kind of militaristic aspects of Germany, but also the way that, because Japan was industrializing at rapid speed as well, and the idea that the kind of system that was implemented there could also work in Japan, but I wouldn't want to take it any further than that for fear of taking that somewhere where I'm not as firm as I would like to be.
We have time, I think, for 2 more questions, and you've waited patiently over there.
Could I ask you to go back to the idea of German identity in the Second Reich? You mentioned some of the things which the Nazis got up to in terms of, creating such an identity. What kind of way in which culture, including the arts, was used in the Second Reich to create German identity? Was it successful, and was it coherent? Did it work?
So Bismarck did have a package of measures to Germanify the country. Especially, he was worried about the sort of ethnic minorities in the country. So Poles in particular posed a significant threat because of their own strive for a nation state. Because Poland obviously isn't a state at this point, so it's carved up half between Prussia and Russia. And so you have millions of Poles who are basically sitting within the German Empire, not wanting to be part of the German Empire. And Bismarck's policies consist in, the education system was incredibly advanced and a lot of money was put into it, and it was made compulsory for the first time as well for people to go to school. And German was made the only language. So if you were in an entirely Polish-speaking community somewhere in the east of the Reich, you would still have to speak German with your Polish teachers who also have to speak German. So you end up with a kind of peculiar situation where entirely Polish-speaking communities suddenly have to converse in German with one another. And the other big driver was conscription. So people had to go, males that is, had to go into military service for 3 years after the reforms were put in place, which is a long time when you're like 16, 17, and suddenly you're in the army for 3 years fighting alongside, or kind of being trained alongside Germans from all over the Reich. And this is one of the kind of really big drivers behind kind of creating a German identity. And you do really begin to see that. I think Wilhelm is actually a good example as well. I mean, he was still a child when Germany was, Wilhelm II that is, when Germany was formed. And his Prussian identity is still there, but he very much sees himself as the first German Kaiser as well, because he's the first one who's actually kind of grown up with the idea of the German state kind of behind him and wanting to unify all Germans behind him. So it's a mixture of kind of deliberate policy, also oppression of the other cultures as well. The French are, I would say, the most resistant perhaps to that movement, in the sense that because they're so concentrated in Alsace and Lorraine, and Bismarck had actually argued against annexing those after the Franco-Prussian War, because he knew that would be trouble. It's not worth having, basically, for the trouble that it caused. But the problem was that in Alsace, the German group is larger than the French one, and so the nationalists were basically saying you do need to annex it. But because those regions could never be pacified, and the French people that lived there, because it's like literally right next to France as well, wouldn't kind of just go, oh, I speak German now, so I must be German. Bismarck eventually just, or the Reich eventually just opens the doors basically and says, you know what, if you're French and you want to be French, then go. And 400,000 people, French people, leave the region over the time and move into kind of the rest of France. And therefore, that's another way of sort of solving that problem, I guess, is that Bismarck just drove them out. And the Danish minorities didn't prove a huge issue. There's still Danish minorities in the north of Germany now, and they tend to, most Danes can tend to sort of call us the big brother state or something along those lines. It's kind of just seen as a similar culture, and therefore, because they're Protestant as well, that helped, I guess, in that sense, the Protestant majority in Germany. So they're conscious of that problem.
Now, another 2 questions. Maybe we can take them together because we are running out of time. And Katja will, of course, be available for some book signings afterwards. So if you have any pressing questions after, then you can ask her then. So there's a microphone here.
Sorry, just very quickly, I have read the book, which is very good, and it's very welcome to have a book on German history that goes outside the 1933-45 period. Question for you, why was the Reichstag so ineffective in fully asserting itself, given that at the same time in France, the Chamber of Deputies was very well able to assert itself, and in Britain we saw a period between 1870 and 1914 when the House of Commons came very much to the fore in the British Constitution, yet Germany didn't, the Reichstag didn't. Can you comment on that? Thank you.
Can we ask the second question as well? That would be great, and then Katja can have the final word.
Yeah, this is kind of another can of worms, so you can skip it if there's not enough time, but just wondering what happened to the German language during this time in general, and in particular how the local dialects, whether they have survived, mutated, or simply went away.
Yep. So on the first question, I think that's to do with the fact that there was no parliamentary culture beforehand. So in Britain, there's this long evolution of kind of a slow and gradual and relatively peaceful process of kind of more and more parliamentary power from the kind of origins in the Privy Council to the King to a relatively confident parliament in the 19th century. In France, they've gone through so many violent kind of stages of various political uprisings. I mean, there's always, even I would say today, more fear in France for kind of political and social unrest. You know, you do something and cars will be set on fire whilst Germans sit and grumble behind closed doors. So I think there's that element as well, the sort of elites. Napoleon III is actually a good example of that. He was constantly worried and knew how precarious his position was, and therefore turned into a far more liberal direction even before he was ousted in the end. In Germany, because you've got, by the end of so just before the First World War, you end up, even then it's only half and half between the conservatives and the liberals and the social democrats on the other side. The liberals after the war had a huge debate in the early 1920s about what went wrong. And one of the things that one of the reproaches they have against themselves as a movement is that they were too cowed, too happy to compromise. The actual term realpolitik is a liberal concept. It's associated with Bismarck, because Bismarck is kind of the ultimate incarnation of that. But it was the liberals saying, if we want to achieve anything, we can't do it violently, we can't be forceful, we must work with the elites. And I think this is a spirit that sunk in so much with them that Bismarck kind of just said, well, it's this or nothing. And they went, well, can we just have a little bit? And he goes, fine, you can have a little bit. But because of that, basically, the compromises always end up leaning towards Bismarck and later the Kaiser, because they are too... They feel like power has been given to them, and therefore they want to hold on to it because they haven't actually sort of fought for it and you know, created enough fear, I think, in the upper echelons of power. And the socialists or the social democrats are still such a new movement, and a lot of them come from sort of lower middle class backgrounds and feel already socially very much out of place in and amongst the kind of, you know, more elegant, sophisticated, socially removed from them kind of classes that they're now associating with. So they're quite often told, you know, you're just a jumped up carpenter or whatever, and you know, already feel a little bit cowed to start with. It takes them virtually all the way up to, I would say, the First World War to gain the confidence to know that they have political power to the extent that they do. So that would be my interpretation on that. And on the German language, quickly, it does get unified a lot because of education, although it's worth pointing out that to this day education in Germany is a matter for each individual state. So it's still not a federal kind of unified education system, but it still means that within each state, people are reading from the same textbooks, are reading in the first place, which is also a huge thing. So the literacy rates are the highest in the world in the German Empire at the time, and because people are therefore reading things like, you know, be that like fairy tales or Karl May's of the kind of Cowboys and Indians is a huge thing. It's still one of the best-selling authors of all times, the German authors, that is. So people are reading the same stuff and therefore acquiring similar vocabulary, but the local dialects, as I was alluding to earlier with the Bavarians, very much stays in place to today. So the federal structure, I'd say, makes itself felt there.
Thank you very much, Katja. I'll be handing over to... No? Oh, okay. I'll wrap it up then. Thank you very much, Katja, for this fascinating talk and also for engaging with our questions so well. Katja will be available for book signings, and thank you all for your interest, and see you.